Andrew had no idea his peaceful suburban home was about to become a battleground. After an exhausting 14-hour shift as a paramedic, all he wanted was a hot shower and a few hours of sleep before doing it all over again. His body ached, his mind was foggy, and every muscle screamed for rest. But as he turned onto his street, his exhaustion turned into confusion, then irritation. Parked dead center in his driveway was an unfamiliar silver SUV, completely blocking his usual spot. His tired brain scrambled for an explanation. Maybe it was a neighbor's guest. A lost delivery driver. Someone in distress. But there was no note, no hazard lights, no sign of an emergency, just that SUV sitting there like it belonged. Frustrated but too drained to deal with it, Andrew found a rare street parking spot and scribbled a polite note, "This is private property. Please don't park here again. Thanks." He tucked it under the windshield wiper, sighed, and trudged inside. His elderly mother, who relied on easy driveway access due to her limited mobility, would struggle with this inconvenience. He had no clue this seemingly minor issue was just the start of an all-out war with the most entitled HOA president in town. The next morning, Andrew woke up still groggy from exhaustion, but the first thing on his mind was that silver SUV. He pulled the curtains open, expecting to see an empty driveway, but there it was, still sitting there like it owned the place. His polite note was gone, nowhere in sight. For a brief moment, he thought maybe the wind had carried it away, but then he spotted a crumpled wad of paper lying in the bushes near his front steps. His note. That was when his frustration began turning into boiling outrage. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't someone who hadn't noticed his message. This was deliberate. He stormed outside, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He glanced up and down the street, trying to guess which neighbor thought they were entitled to his driveway. Was it someone from next door? A visitor who decided his space was more convenient than street parking? His elderly mother relied on that driveway. She couldn't afford to be maneuvering around someone else's vehicle just because they were too self-important to follow basic common courtesy. Determined to give them one last chance, Andrew wrote another note, this time with bold, capitalized letters. "This is private property. Do not park here again. Final warning." He slapped it onto the windshield, making sure it was wedged under the wipers so it wouldn't conveniently blow away. He stared at the SUV for a moment longer, his fists clenched. What kind of person ignored a simple request like this? But the real insult came the next morning. When Andrew left the house for a grocery run, the SUV was still there. Not only that, but his final warning note had been shredded into tiny pieces and scattered all over his driveway. Deliberately. Maliciously. His pulse thundered in his ears. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was personal. His exhaustion was now overshadowed by pure rage. Whoever this person was, they had just made a mistake, a big one. And Andrew was about to make sure they regretted it. Andrew didn't have to wait long to find out who the entitled owner of the SUV was. The very next morning, as he stood outside, glaring at the vehicle that had taken up residence in his driveway like some unwanted guest, the front door across the street swung open. Out stepped Karen Whitmore, the self-appointed queen of the HOA and the biggest thorn in the neighborhood's side. Andrew felt his stomach twist. He had heard plenty of stories about her from neighbors, the constant fines, the ridiculous rules, the smug superiority that oozed from her every move, but he had never personally been in her crosshairs. Until now. Karen marched toward him with the swagger of someone who had never been told no in her life, her sharp heels clicking against the pavement like a countdown to disaster. Her platinum blonde bob was perfectly angled, her pressed white blouse screamed power-hungry dictator, and the permanent scowl on her face made Andrew's blood boil before she even opened her mouth. "What exactly are you doing near my car?" she snapped, her arms folding across her chest like she was scolding a child. Andrew's jaw clenched. "Your car." She smirked. "Yes. Parking is a nightmare around here, and as HOA president, I have a lot of important business. Your driveway was convenient. Andrew couldn't believe what he was hearing. She was treating his property like a public parking lot. He let out a slow breath, trying to keep his voice calm. Karen, this is my private driveway. You can't just park here whenever you feel like it. Karen let out an exaggerated sigh, waving a dismissive hand. Oh, come on, Andrew. It's not like you're using it all the time. If it's that big of a deal, you should have come to me personally instead of leaving little notes like a coward. Andrew's hands curled into fists. This woman had ignored his notes, shredded them, and was now calling him the problem. He took a slow step forward, his voice low and firm. This is your final warning. Move your car. Now. Karen's smirk only widened. Oh, Andrew. If you want me gone, you're going to have to do a lot more than just ask. With that, she turned on her heel, climbed into her SUV, and sped off like she had just won a battle. Andrew stood there, fists clenched, watching the oil stains she left behind. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Andrew knew Karen wasn't going to stop. Entitled people never back down, at least, not until they were forced to. The confrontation had only fueled her audacity, and now, more than ever, she would see just how much she could push him. But Andrew was done being polite. If she wanted a battle, he was going to make sure she lost. For the next few days, he played the waiting game. He watched. He documented. He made sure that every time Karen parked in his driveway, he had photo evidence, time-stamped and saved. And then, with a sense of grim satisfaction, he made a phone call, one that he should have made long ago. It was early morning when Andrew heard the familiar, infuriating sound of Karen's SUV pulling into his driveway once again. He peered through the blinds, his heart pounding with anticipation. This time, she wasn't alone. A second car, a silver sedan, pulled up right behind her, boxing his own vehicle in. Andrew's eyes narrowed. 2 cars. She was doubling down. He clenched his jaw. Perfect. Andrew stepped outside just as Karen and her friend, another HOA lackey, no doubt, stepped out, laughing like they owned the place. You're blocking me in, Andrew called, voice sharp as a blade. Karen barely looked at him, tossing her keys into her purse like she didn't have a care in the world. Oh, don't be dramatic, Andrew. We won't be long. Andrew didn't say another word. He simply pulled out his phone, hit a saved number, and waited. Karen and her friend were halfway up her driveway when the first tow truck rumbled down the street, its bright orange hazard lights flashing like a beacon of karma. A second truck followed closely behind. The moment Karen turned, her smug grin shattered. What the hell is this? She screeched. Andrew finally let himself smirk. Oh, Karen, he said, arms crossed, voice dripping with satisfaction. If you want your cars gone, you're going to have to do a lot more than just ask. Karen's eyes widened in sheer disbelief as the first tow truck operator stepped out, clipboard in hand, assessing the situation with professional indifference. The second driver, a burly man with tattooed arms, strode toward the silver sedan, already reaching for the hook. The neighborhood had never been this quiet. Andrew folded his arms, leaning against his porch railing, waiting. Karen, however, was anything but calm. Stop. Stop this right now, she shrieked, bolting down the driveway like her life depended on it. Her heels clacked wildly against the pavement, her carefully styled blonde bob shaking with every movement. Her friend, the owner of the silver sedan, looked equally horrified, clutching her phone as if it were a lifeline. The tow truck driver barely looked at her. Both vehicles are illegally parked on private property, ma'am. Owner of the house called it in. You'll have to pay the retrieval fees. Karen's face turned crimson, her hands balling into fists. You can't just, this is harassment. I'm the HOA president. I have rights. Andrew finally spoke, his tone calm but brimming with satisfaction. "Funny, Karen. I said the same thing when you kept trespassing on my property." The tow truck driver turned to Andrew. "You sure you want both towed?" Andrew pretended to think about it. He could hear Karen's friend frantically whispering into her phone, probably calling anyone who would listen. But Andrew already knew nobody was coming to save them. "Yeah," he said finally, watching Karen's expression twist in horror. "Tow them both." The chains clanked. The gears shifted. The first hook caught onto the undercarriage of Karen's beloved SUV, and as the tow truck driver started tightening the mechanism, she lost whatever composure she had left. "You can't do this," she screamed. But Andrew just tilted his head, arms still crossed, as the SUV lifted off the ground. The queen of the HOA had just realized her throne wasn't as secure as she thought. For the first time in all the years Karen had spent lording over the neighborhood, she was powerless. The tow truck was already hauling her SUV down the street, leaving her standing there, fists clenched, eyes wild with fury. But Andrew wasn't done. Not by a long shot. He turned to face her, his stance firm, refusing to be intimidated. "You've spent years bullying this neighborhood, Karen. I think it's time we talk about the real problem here, you." Karen sputtered, her face turning an impressive shade of red. "You don't understand. I was only enforcing the rules. That's my job as HOA president." Andrew pulled out his phone and scrolled through his neatly organized folder of evidence. "You mean like when you threatened Mr. Rodriguez over his ramp? Or fined the Thompsons for their Christmas lights? Oh, and let's not forget how you tried to have my father's ramp removed under the excuse of aesthetic violations." He tilted the phone toward her, letting her see the damning collection of HOA notices, photos, and recorded confrontations. Karen froze. For the first time, her confidence cracked, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. The gathered neighbors murmured amongst themselves, some nodding in agreement. People who had once been too afraid to speak up were now stepping forward. Linda, an elderly woman who had been fined for having unapproved flower pots, shook her head. "I lost over $500 to your ridiculous fines, Karen. You're not helping this community, you're draining it." Mark, the firefighter from down the street, crossed his arms. "You've been abusing your position for too long. We're sick of it." Karen tried to laugh it off. "You all are being dramatic." But Andrew cut her off, his voice steady and full of finality. "No, Karen. You lost. And now, it's time for you to face the consequences." For once, Karen had no comeback. And that was the most satisfying victory of all. Karen had always been untouchable, or at least, she thought she was. But now, the neighborhood she had controlled for years was turning against her. The tow truck incident had sent shockwaves through the community, and Andrew's unyielding stand made people realize something: they didn't have to live under Karen's rule anymore. Still, Karen wasn't one to go down without a fight. She stormed back to her house, slamming the door so hard the sound echoed down the street. By morning, retaliation came in the form of new violation notices taped to mailboxes, a desperate last-ditch effort to reassert control. Andrew's mailbox alone had 5 citations: 1 for excessive outdoor decorations, his father's accessible ramp, 1 for unapproved landscaping, a flower bed his sister had planted months ago, and even 1 for aggressive behavior toward an HOA officer, which was rich, considering the only aggression had come from Karen herself. But Andrew wasn't falling into her trap. He didn't rage or tear up the notices. Instead, he did something Karen didn't expect: he documented everything. He snapped pictures, saved the notices, and even pulled up the HOA bylaws to cross-check her supposed infractions. Meanwhile, word spread. The neighbors, many of whom had suffered under Karen's reign for years, started coming forward with their own stories. Mr. Peterson, a retired teacher, admitted he had paid hundreds of dollars in mysterious HOA fees for neighborhood improvement projects that had never happened. The Martinez family, who had moved in last year, shared how Karen had threatened to report them for illegal renovations, even though they had city-approved permits. The cracks in Karen's empire were starting to show. And then came the final blow. An anonymous tip, likely from a fed-up resident, reached the city's housing authority. Investigators were looking into the HOA's financial records. Karen had always used fear to control the neighborhood, but now she was the one with something to be afraid of. Karen had spent years wielding power over the neighborhood like a tyrant, making lives miserable with fines, threats, and arbitrary rules. But now the weight of her own arrogance and greed was finally crashing down on her. It started with a knock on her door. Not the friendly, neighborly kind, but the kind that made even the most self-righteous dictators hesitate. Two city investigators, armed with clipboards, stern expressions, and a folder thick with complaints, stood on her porch. Karen barely had time to adjust her fake smile before they started asking questions. The entire neighborhood watched from a distance, peeking from windows, lingering on sidewalks, pretending to water their lawns. Word had already spread, Karen was under investigation. And Andrew? He was standing on his porch, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold like a well-earned finale. At first, Karen tried to charm her way out of it. She waved her manicured hand, tossed her hair, and insisted it was all just a misunderstanding. But when the investigators pulled out receipts for misused HOA funds, fraudulent violations, and even financial discrepancies linked to personal home upgrades she had charged to the HOA account, her smirk finally cracked. Then came the real justice. An official notice was stapled to the HOA's community board. Karen was being removed from her position, pending further legal action. The once feared HOA president was now stripped of her title, her power, and her influence. The neighbors who had once cowered under her rule. They started talking. Complaints flooded in, refund demands, written statements of her abuse of power, and even a petition to disband the HOA altogether. And the best part? The very people Karen had terrorized for years, Andrew, his father, the Martinez family, Mr. Peterson, were now the ones holding her accountable. As she stomped back into her house, defeated and humiliated, Andrew simply smiled. Poetic justice had finally been served. The days following Karen's downfall were nothing short of chaotic. It was like watching a dam burst, one that had been holding back years of resentment, anger, and pent-up frustration. The once feared HOA president, who had ruled with an iron fist and a clipboard full of violations, was suddenly nothing more than a spectacle. At first, she tried to deny everything. She stormed into the community meeting, demanding that the board reinstate her, calling it all a witch hunt. But the evidence was overwhelming. The missing HOA funds, the fabricated violations, the illegally towed cars, the bogus maintenance charges, it was all laid out for everyone to see. No one came to her defense. Even her once loyal inner circle of rule-obsessed enforcers were turning their backs, suddenly finding their shoes incredibly interesting whenever she spoke. The people she had bullied for years were done being afraid. Then came the financial backlash. Homeowners who had been unfairly fined demanded refunds. Families who had paid extra fees for mysterious community improvements began questioning where their money had gone. And the HOA's lawyer? He quit on the spot when he realized the legal storm that was coming. Karen tried to play the victim. She called an emergency meeting, which no one attended. She sent out emails filled with pleas and excuses, but no one replied. She even tried to pass off the blame on the board members, but the city's investigation team wasn't buying it. And then, the final humiliation. A formal eviction notice appeared on Karen's door, not from the HOA, but from her own mortgage lender. Turns out, she hadn't just been mismanaging HOA funds, she had been mismanaging her own. The walls were closing in. Andrew stood across the street watching as Karen frantically yanked the notice off her door. The woman who once threatened, fined, and intimidated everyone in the neighborhood was now the one with no power, no allies, and no way out. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt peaceful. And Karen? She had finally lost the war she started. For years, Karen had lorded over the neighborhood like a self-appointed queen, wielding HOA bylaws like a medieval sword, cutting down anyone who dared to cross her. But now, the empire she had built on fear, intimidation, and corruption lay in ruins. And Andrew? He stood at the center of it all, watching the collapse with the kind of vindication that only comes after a long, exhausting battle. The final blow came when the city's housing authority issued its ruling. Karen wasn't just being removed from the HOA, she was permanently banned from ever holding a leadership position in any HOA again. The news spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had once whispered in fear now cheered in open celebration. Some brought out folding chairs and sat on their lawns, watching as Karen's prized SUV, recently retrieved from the impound lot, was now being loaded onto a moving truck. Andrew couldn't resist. He stepped onto his porch, arms crossed, watching with satisfaction as Karen furiously barked orders at the movers. Even now, she was trying to exert control over a situation she had no power in. But no one was listening. Not the HOA board, not the neighbors, and certainly not Andrew. She saw him watching and stomped across the street, her face contorted in barely restrained rage. "I hope you're proud of yourself," she spat, jabbing a finger toward his chest. "You think you've won? You just destroyed this neighborhood. You'll regret this, Andrew." But Andrew didn't flinch. He simply smiled, slow and triumphant. "No, Karen," he said, his voice calm and unwavering. "I saved this neighborhood. From you." Karen opened her mouth, searching for a comeback, but nothing came. Her power was gone, her influence shattered, and for the first time since she had moved in, she had no way to manipulate, threaten, or control. She had lost. As the moving truck rumbled away, the entire street erupted into applause. The reign of Karen was finally over. The neighborhood was free. And Andrew? He had never felt more victorious. With Karen gone, the neighborhood felt like it had taken its first deep breath in years. The tension that had once hung over Crestwood like a thick, oppressive fog had lifted overnight. It was as if the entire community had been holding back, waiting for permission to exist without the constant fear of arbitrary fines and HOA citations. For Andrew, the transformation was almost surreal. No more pink violation notices tucked under his windshield wiper. No more early morning confrontations over non-existent infractions. The driveway that Karen had treated like her personal parking spot remained blissfully empty, except for his own car, the way it was meant to be. But Karen's departure didn't just mark the end of a reign of terror, it left behind the question of what came next. Without her iron grip, the HOA was in complete disarray. The board members who had once cowered under her leadership were now scrambling to clean up the mess she had left behind. Missing financial records, unauthorized citations, and a long list of bogus fines were just the tip of the iceberg. Andrew was far from the only one who had suffered. One by one, neighbors began stepping forward, sharing their own stories of Karen's harassment. The single mother Karen had threatened with child protective services. The elderly couple forced to repaint their mailbox twice in 1 year. The veteran who had been fined for flying an American flag on his own porch. Determined to right these wrongs, Andrew and a few trusted neighbors petitioned for an internal HOA audit. They wanted every unfair fine refunded, every bogus citation overturned. More importantly, they wanted to ensure that no future HOA president could ever weaponize the rules the way Karen had. The momentum was unstoppable. At the next HOA meeting, the first one not ruled by Karen's tyranny, Andrew stood up and made a motion for sweeping reforms. It was met with thunderous approval. Karen had spent years tearing the neighborhood apart. Now, in her absence, Andrew and his neighbors were about to do something she never could, bring it back together. With Karen gone and her iron grip over the HOA shattered, Crestwood began to heal. The first real sign of change came when Andrew stepped outside one morning and saw something that nearly brought a tear to his eye: neighbors talking, laughing, and actually enjoying their community. For the first time in years, people weren't afraid to linger on their porches, decorate their yards, or simply exist without fear of receiving a violation notice. To celebrate, Andrew and a few others organized a community gathering, a symbolic rebirth of the neighborhood. The same park where Karen had once banned unsanctioned events was now filled with the sounds of children playing, the smell of barbecue in the air, and genuine laughter. The single mother Karen had tormented. She was there with her kids, free from worry. The elderly couple forced to repaint their mailbox. They were finally at peace. Andrew looked around, feeling something he hadn't in a long time: pride. His battle against Karen had never been about revenge, it had been about standing up for what was right. And as he watched his community come together, he knew one thing for certain: they had won.